Today is Tuesday, 5th November, the main day of the US presidential election in the United States. I say the main day because, of course, tens of millions of Americans have already voted in the election. Early voting has now become a widespread phenomenon in the United States. And there seems to be contrary indications on how that is playing out and in favour of which of the two candidates. And in fact, it's very difficult for me from London, someone who basically whose knowledge of the United States, his direct knowledge of the United States is limited to one city in the United States, which is New York City, a very untypical city as I understand by American standards. But anyway, very difficult for someone like me in faraway London to gauge the mood in the United States or the trends in an election in a society as complex and in many ways, in many respects, as sophisticated and, of course, as huge as the United States is. For what it's worth, about a week ago, there appeared to be a solidifying consensus that Donald Trump was ahead and was more likely to win. Then a few days ago, the sentiment changed, and this was largely triggered by a single opinion poll in the state of Iowa, which appeared to suggest that there'd been a swing, a very big swing, by voters in Iowa. And despite the fact that Iowa is normally considered a firm Republican state, and despite the fact that Donald Trump has historically led in opinion polls in Iowa, this poll, to many people's astonishment, put Kamala Harris slightly ahead of Donald Trump. Now, I am not an expert on opinion polls in the United States and certainly not an expert in opinion polls in Iowa. The pollster, Ann Seltzer, apparently has a very, very good reputation, and her polls are often considered to be particularly reliable. However, I would say that this poll, with a poll of 800 people, seems to me a rather small poll, even for a single state in the United States. And I understand that there have been other polls also taken in Iowa, which still show Donald Trump comfortably ahead in the state. I'm a little surprised discussing this election from faraway London that one opinion poll in one state, relatively small poll of 800 people, should have changed the mood, the sentiment about the election so completely as that particular poll did. But anyway, after that poll appeared, we've had lots of speculation, lots of rumours that the trends in the opinion polls were now beginning to shift in Kamala Harris's direction. There was said to be a late surge amongst independents and especially women towards Kamala Harris. And I think it's fair to say that until yesterday, the mood seemed to be shifting back in her favour. And then this morning, we're starting to see another mood shift, once again, from what I can see, tilting back towards Donald Trump. And this seems to be based more on the results of early voting than anything else, except we're not actually talking about the results of early voting, because as far as I can tell, no votes so far have actually been counted, or at least officially counted, at least not at the moment. But there is a general perception that the Republicans, that Donald Trump, in other words, have done a lot better in early polling in the United States in this election than they have generally done in other elections previously. So, again, I'm not going to rush to any judgments. As I said, no votes have so far been counted. The general consensus still seems to be that the election is on a knife edge. As I said, there's some reason to think, or at least some people are saying this morning, that the election is tilting slightly in Donald Trump's favour. We will probably have a better, or at least a clearer idea of where things are, either by early tomorrow morning. I've been morning in London, by the way, or perhaps by the late afternoon. Though, of course, it has been known in the United States, in several elections, by the way, that the outcome of elections can take days, sometimes even weeks, to become clear. So anyway, this is a complicated way of saying that I am not going to try and predict the outcome of the election in the United States. There is a lot of information circulating, some of which points one direction, other parts of it point in a different direction. I do not have the granular knowledge and understanding of American society and of American politics to make the kind of judgment about the outcome of an election that I can do about elections in, say, Britain or Greece, or even to some extent Germany or France, just to say. So we'll have to wait and see. If you're looking to me to predict the outcome tomorrow, I'm not able to do so. I'm not even going to venture a guess because I don't have enough information to be able to provide a guess. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the American election as of now. One point, however, I do want to make, which is that this election does indeed matter. We are dealing with two profoundly different personalities, with two profoundly different teams. Donald Trump has reached out to people like J.D. Vance, Robert Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, and others who, from my perspective, take a much more realistic and level-headed approach to foreign policy than some of the people, not all of the people, but some of the people who have congregated around Kamala Harris. And that is an important factor in telling us how things could shape out, depending on who wins the election. I don't agree with the view that this election will make no difference. I think it will make a significant difference who the victor of the election is going to be. Now, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that whoever does win the election, they're going to have to start right away dealing with a host of problems that have accumulated over the last 4 years. It is really astonishing to look back at the situation before the current administration and to remember how generally stable the international situation was at that time. The war in Syria seemed to be coming to an end. The war in Afghanistan was continuing in a desultory fashion, but the United States, under Donald Trump's presidency, had made a political decision to withdraw. The situation in Ukraine was very unstable and uncertain, but there was a new president, Vladimir Zelensky, who at this time seemed to be interested in trying to make the Minsk agreement work and trying to find some means to bring peace to Ukraine and peace between Ukraine and Russia. How serious Zelensky was about that back in 2020 and 2019 is a completely different matter. And of course, he faced enormous opposition within Ukraine and from some of Ukraine's Western allies. But I still believe, personally, that if the American administration and the US government had given him solid backing, or at least pushed him towards negotiations with the Russians, which was, of course, what Zelensky had been elected to do. When I talk about the Russians, I don't just mean the Russian government, but the authorities in the two people's republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk people's republics. Well, we might have seen some sort of peace and some sort of avoidance of war. And yes, there had been a significant deterioration in the relations between the United States and China during Donald Trump's time, but things were still basically under control. The two countries were talking to each other, and the situation concerning Taiwan had not deteriorated to the very dangerous levels that we have today. And Donald Trump had made a serious attempt to try to forge some kind of political dialogue with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. It still amazes me that people in the West, so many people in the West, continue to be critical of Donald Trump's outreach to Kim Jong-un. I thought at the time, and I think still, it was the wisest and most sensible thing, given the intractable problems that the relationship with North Korea gives rise to. It was the wisest thing that Donald Trump could have done. And again, if followed through properly, it might have led to some kind of stabilization or easing of tensions in the Korean Peninsula. But at any rate, at least at that time, the general state of things in the Korean Peninsula was, if not peaceful, at least relatively quiet. And of course, if we're talking about the Middle East, the situation was, or at least appeared to be, very quiet. As I said, the war in Syria appeared to be winding down. Donald Trump again wanted to withdraw US troops from Syria. Again, it astonishes me that it is still seen as a success by some people in the United States and Europe that Donald Trump's attempts to pull US troops out of eastern Syria and to bring the war in that unhappy country, that those successful attempts to prevent him doing that are seen by some people as a success. But anyway, just to say. And, well, the jihadi movements in Iraq had been defeated. The leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, was killed in an airstrike, an American airstrike, commando raid. And one can't say that there was peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but at least the situation was not as dangerous as it is now. And we were not looking at a situation where the Iranians and the Israelis were launching missiles at each other. So things were far from easy or even good in the Middle East, but at least the situation was not as bad as we have today. And look at the situation today. Look at the difference that we've seen in the last 4 years. Well, of course, Afghanistan, the war ended there with an American retreat and a Taliban victory. The conflict in Syria continues. There's still American troops in Syria. Doing what exactly? Nobody seems able precisely to say. Relations between the United States and one of its key allies, Turkey, have gone from bad to worse. Turkey has now made an application to join the BRICS and has been admitted as a BRICS partner state. The relationship between Israel and Iran has taken a catastrophic turn, with the Iranians and the Israelis launching direct attacks upon each other's territory, something we had never seen before. Israel finds itself in wars in Gaza and in Lebanon with no end in sight. There is still some euphoria in Israel. The Israelis still believe that they're on some kind of a roll. I can't see any evidence of that myself. But anyway, some people continue to believe that. The situation in the Asia-Pacific region has become far worse. China has now launching a massive naval buildup. They're becoming increasingly angry and concerned about American policy towards Taiwan. We've had situations where Xi Jinping has told Biden over the course of an actual meeting that he no longer trusts Biden or the United States, specifically on the topic of Taiwan. And we had a further situation, where the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has told Tony Blinken to his face that the United States' foreign policy is two-faced. When US officials, when Tony Blinken comes to China, he's no longer received courteously at the airport by Chinese officials, and they stay away when he leaves. It's nothing perhaps could illustrate more clearly how bad, how tense the relationship between China and the United States has become. And of course, the biggest story of all in terms of crisis, we've had a massive crisis between Russia and the West. The relationship between Russia and the West over the last 4 years has completely collapsed. We've had huge numbers of sanctions imposed by the West upon Russia, achieving the diametrically opposite result to those that were intended. They did not trigger the collapse of the Russian economy, which has been going through a over rapid boom, but they have severely undermined the economic stability of Europe, and they are tipping Germany into a situation of permanent stagnation and industrial decline, which is now leading to a political crisis in that country. And of course, against the backdrop of all that, there is an ongoing war in Ukraine, a massive war, the biggest war by far fought in Europe since the Second World War, which the United States has been involved in, acting, using Ukraine as a proxy in a contest with Russia, which it is losing, and which has resulted in all sorts of people in the United States coming up with extraordinary demands in the United States and in Ukraine, coming up with all sorts of demands for all sorts of incredibly dangerous forms of escalation, missile strikes on Russia and that kind of thing. So, a massive deterioration in the global situation. We've gone from a period of relative peace 4 years ago to one of conflict and war in more and more places. And on top of all of that, partly in response to the enormous expansion of sanctions that we have seen over the last 4 years, we have seen the first serious moves being made by this group of countries, the BRICS countries, which is now coalescing into something that still falls just short of a bloc, but which is beginning to acquire some of the trappings of an economic and even geopolitical bloc. Anyway, we have seen the first steps by this bloc, or evolving bloc, to create an alternative global financial system, trading system, outside the Bretton Woods institutions in rivalry to those dominated up to now by the United States. Obviously, this will be a long-term development. Many people still seem to think that the Kazan Declaration, which, by the way, I consider to be an all but revolutionary act, despite its extremely measured and moderate language. Anyway, many people still feel either disappointed that it didn't go further or dismissive of what was achieved in Kazan. I think anybody who takes that view, at least in the West, is being altogether complacent and is in denial about the realities of what is taking place there. So that is the difference that we have seen over these last 4 years. And whoever is elected president in January is going to have to hit the ground running and is going to have to try and put out these various fires, or at least damp them down, and start getting the channels of international diplomacy reopened again, so that the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the Saudis and the Iranians and the Israelis are all finally talking to each other. And once we do that, once we can start to stabilize the international geopolitical environment, we might also start to see some moves towards stabilizing the international economic situation as well. Because, of course, one of the major reasons why there are economic stresses wherever you look is because the collapse of the international system is creating trade tensions. We see this with all the various sanctions that have been imposed. The energy markets have been thrown into chaos. The food markets also. We've seen how that's worked through with inflation problems in the West also. You cannot solve all of these problems unless you bring back some degree of stability to the international diplomatic position. Now, I understand that some people in the United States continue to insist that despite the fact that everything everywhere else, except, by the way, in Russia, is now encountering all kinds of economic headwinds, that the United States itself is all right. Well, there was an article in the Financial Times, of all places, which called that into question and with which I completely agreed. And its point was that what we have seen in the United States also over the last 4 years is a mirage of economic expansion, largely carried out on the back of a huge fiscal expansion. A fiscal expansion which sooner or later is going to prove unsustainable, but which, whilst it is continuing, is itself causing major instabilities within the economic system. And I appreciate that this is again a view which not everybody wants to share. Many people are in denial about this, but the article, just to give its title, "The US Economic Boom is a Mirage. Its lopsided, brittle quality helps explain why so many Americans will cast votes in anger." And it is by Ruchir Sharma, and it is in the Financial Times. And though one must always be careful about believing or treating an article or a book or anything which confirms one's own views as, well, which supports one's own views as confirming their truth, suffice to say that I do hold to these views, the views expressed in this article. I do believe that they are basically correct. And again, the next president of the United States is going to have to address these problems and address those problems very fast. Now, I'm not going to make judgments about the personalities of the two candidates. Jeffrey Sachs, who is somebody that we regularly host on the Duran, one of the most insightful and, by the way, humane people I know. Somebody who is, of course, an American and who understands the realities of American politics far more deeply and correctly than I do. Someone who has access to people in the United States in ways that I absolutely don't. Anyway, he has spoken scathingly about both candidates, and he has taken the view that in light of that, there really is no point in his voting, and he's made a decision that since the choice is between bad and bad, one might as well make a decision which is not to vote at all. And by the way, I'm in no way critical of that. I've always taken the view that a decision not to vote in an election is an entirely valid one. All of these people who constantly insist that one is under some sort of moral or political obligation to vote, and that one shouldn't exercise one's judgment and decide to abstain. Well, I've never held with that view at all. But having said that, and despite the criticisms that can be made of both candidates, I still look at the teams, the two teams, and also I ask myself, what was the situation 4 years ago? And what is the situation now? And if I think about things in those terms, well, I don't think it's difficult to work out what I think what outcome I think might just be the better outcome to come out of this election. I'm going to be careful what I say. I'm always careful what I say on these programs, but you, my viewers, can probably guess my views and my preferences, though I have no confidence that my preferences in this election are going to be realised. And by the way, even if they are, I have little confidence that any of my hopes will be fulfilled either. Quite probably, Professor Sachs is going to be proved right on that count also. But one can hope only, and after all, without hope, what is left? So, for that reason, I have the preferences that I do. But anyway, there we are. Whoever becomes president has a huge amount to do in January. To repeat again, this is the most precarious time in international relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And I suspect that the economic problems are almost as intractable and as dangerous, and they are also in urgent need of attention also. So anyway, that is what I'm going to say about the American election today. Those of you who are in the United States, it is your decision, your choice. Obviously, who the people of the United States votes for matters to the world. The United States is still, in most respects, the most important country in making the international weather. May not be the biggest economy anymore on purchasing power parity terms, the biggest economy and certainly the biggest manufacturing economy and the biggest trader in actual goods is no longer the United States, it is China. But the United States, in terms of shaping events, still remains in pole position. And I do appreciate that Americans, rightly, will vote for whichever candidate they believe will make their own life better. But I nonetheless hope that they will, when they vote, give some thought to these global international issues that I have laid out in this program. Anyway, there we are. That's what I'm going to say today about the election. Now, there's been less information from the Middle East over the last 24 hours, but President Putin has been very busy. He's had a meeting today in which he's accepted the credentials of various foreign ambassadors. He's used that meeting to make statements about the international situation, and I'm sure that he's done that in the context of the election in the United States. He has reiterated that the Russians are open for dialogue. They're open for dialogue on economic matters, on general security matters. He has said that they're open for dialogue even about the crisis in Ukraine. He said that he never has rejected dialogue, nor has Russia. He pointed out that, on the contrary, Russia worked painstakingly to try to achieve peace in Ukraine several times, the last time, of course, being with the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. So he is clearly signaling to the next president of the United States that if that president wants to change course, if that president wants to ease back on confrontation, the Russians are prepared to sit down and to listen to what the Americans have to say. And putting aside the question of Ukraine, where things have now become so complex and difficult as to be all but intractable, I'm very skeptical about the prospects of any kind of resolution of the situation in Ukraine by political or diplomatic means. I've made that clear already. But there is a larger potential relationship between the United States and Russia, which in their joint interests they need to develop. Obviously, that relationship must first address the security concerns that each has, and hopefully, at least that's what Putin is signaling, that can get restarted. He's open for dialogue. The new president, when he or she takes office in January, if she wants a call, if she wants to speak to Putin, contrary to what has often been said, Putin has made this very clear over the last few days, he will answer the call. It is not true that he's not answering his phone. He's made it very clear that he's prepared to answer the phone and to speak to the President of the United States, as he has spoken to every American president ever since he became President of Russia, at a time when the President of the United States was, of course, Bill Clinton. So anyway, that's what Putin has been saying. Now, the Russians have, however, done something else over the last 24 hours, which is perhaps maybe not so much a signal to the United States exactly. I'm not sure how thought through this is, but they have done something which perhaps does remind us that they have options if the United States won't talk to them, if it wants to continue the process of confrontation. The Russians are in a position to take steps that will continue to solidify their positions and their international relationships. And those are two things. The first is that President Putin in the Kremlin has had a meeting with North Korea's foreign minister, Choi Son-hui. And the meeting has taken place in the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has provided one of the shortest readouts of that meeting that I have ever seen, though we have been given a fairly thorough photographic study. We see Putin shaking hands with Foreign Minister Choi. We see Russian officials, Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Ushakov sort of looking at each other. They were also present at the meeting. And we see Putin looking, well, thoughtful as he meets Choi, and Choi herself looking cheerful and friendly. So anyway, there is this meeting in the Kremlin, and the Kremlin readout, just to read it, it says, attending the meeting on the Russian side, the meeting reads, meeting with Foreign Minister of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Choi Son-hui. Vladimir Putin met with Foreign Minister of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Choi Son-hui, in the Kremlin. Attending the meeting on the Russian side were Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Presidential aide Yuri Ushakov. And earlier, the foreign ministers of Russia and the DPRK also had a meeting in Moscow. And about that meeting, the Russian Foreign Ministry has provided us with some information. So has Lavrov. I can't say, to be honest, that it takes us very far. But anyway, there was a readout from the Russian Foreign Ministry about the meeting, and it seems as if the meeting went relatively well, and the two foreign ministers, as we've seen, have met, and well, we'll see how the relationship between North Korea and Russia develops. I don't think that this meeting, by the way, was about deploying North Korean troops to the battle zone in Kursk region. If that had been the purpose of the meeting, then presumably military officials would have attended, would have been participating, and there is no evidence that they have been. But of course, the presence of North Korean troops in Russia as part of what I suspect is, as I said, an advanced training program. I will return to this topic in a moment. Anyway, the presence of North Korean troops in Russia is a signal of the improving relations between Russia and North Korea, of the fact that North Korea is no longer isolated and under economic siege in the way that it has been recently. There are reports that the Russians are preparing to provide North Korea with 800,000 tons of rice, which would apparently cover North Korea's needs for rice, for food, over the next year. And I've no doubt that there'll be many more economic relations developing as well. As I discussed, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, I've now seen what I believe to be true reports that North Korean workers are arriving in Russia's Far East and are being brought to work in Russian car factories and other industrial facilities, helping to ease Russia's problems in terms of skilled workers, many of whom have been called up to fight in the war. And I suspect we're going to see an awful lot more of that over the next few weeks. But anyway, this meeting has taken place between Lavrov and Choi, and between Putin and Choi, and it is intended to signal that the Russians do have other friends, North Korea as well. The United States might not be happy about that, but the Russians are developing that relationship. And the other step the Russians have taken is an interesting one, and it has a military dimension, which is that their fifth generation fighter jet, the Sukhoi 57, has, for the first time, been publicly deployed and exhibited outside China. And we've had confirmation of this from Global Times. There is an air show. There's the Air Show China 2024. This is a major air show that the Chinese military puts on. Well, not just the Chinese military, but the entire Chinese aviation sector, both civil and military, has put on. And the Russians have sent an impressive series of aircraft to participate, Sukhoi 35s and Sukhoi 30s, I believe, but also the Sukhoi 57, fifth generation fighter. And the interesting fact about that is that, of course, the Chinese are also displaying at the same air show their own two stealth fighter jets, the J-20, and apparently the new J-35A, their small stealth fighter, the equivalent, if you like, of the F-35s, of which there are rumours that it will be the main fighter jet deployed on Chinese aircraft carriers. The Russians, by the way, also have a program to develop a small fifth generation fighter. This is the Sukhoi 75, which is it's still got some work to do. It's well behind in this type of program, though the Russians have already deployed a potential model, and that apparently they're still working on. It apparently requires its new engine, which is the engine that will also be used on the Sukhoi 57 as well. So anyway, the point is that at this air show in China, the Eurasian states, China, Russia, are going to be bringing together in one place all their fifth generation fighters, the ones that are now actively in service. The Sukhoi 57, which has been actually operating and conducting combat missions in the Ukraine war, principally, it seems, over the Black Sea, and of course the Chinese J-20. And then, as I said, we're going to be seeing for the first time the J-35A. So all of these stealth fighters brought together in one place. These are obviously the most advanced fighter jets of these two countries. The fact that they are all being shown together in one air show will enable the militaries of each of these countries, and by their way, their aerospace engineers and technicians, to learn a great deal about each other's aircraft, always assuming, of course, that they don't know a great deal about these aircraft already. So anyway, there we go. And it is in a kind of a way a show of force. It demonstrates to the United States that the other side is now in the stealth fighter, fifth generation fighter race. And it is also a show of trust. The Chinese and the Russians willing to share information about their most advanced fighter jets with each other. Again, maybe this is not a message to the Americans, but it is a way of the Russians maybe signaling that they do have friends. If the Americans want to continue this policy of confrontation with Russia, then the Russians are not on their own. And the Chinese, doubtless, will be thinking in the same way. Anyway, there we are. Those are the various diplomatic moves that the Russians are taking. There's actually, if one is talking about global diplomacy, a brief moment of quiet in the world as everybody fixes their gazes on the United States and waits to see what the outcome of the election will be. And of course, it's important to remember this is not just a presidential election. in the United States. It's also a general election. The House of Representatives and a third of the Senate is also being elected, and of course there's state elections in many of the US states as well. And the outcome of the Senate races will also be important, if only because many people around the world now understand very well that though the executive in the United States obviously has the dominant role in shaping foreign policy, the Senate cannot be ignored. And if the new president, faces a hostile Senate, then that will affect the new president's ability to conduct foreign policy in the way that they want. Anyway, so those are the steps that the Russians are taking. Everybody else is waiting to see. In Europe, I suspect, waiting with intense anxiety. There, they are heavily invested in the outcome of the US election. Just to say, there will be huge relief if Harris wins, and there will be deep despondency if Trump does. Perhaps these sentiments will be exaggerated in either direction. Maybe the realities will not bear out, or do not correspond to the hopes and fears that the Europeans have. But the Europeans have worked themselves up into a huge state about this election and about the two candidates. And if things turn out otherwise than they want, well, we'll just see how they respond to it, but they certainly won't be happy. Anyway, that's the situation, as I said, on the eve of the election, of the actual final voting in the United States. What about what is going on in the world? As I said, in the Middle East, we are now at the moment in a period of relative quiet. The war in Ukraine is completely different. That continues in exactly the same way that it has been doing for the last, almost 3 years now. The Ukrainians yesterday claimed that there'd been the first military clash between their forces and the North Korean forces in the Kursk region. They provided not a scintilla of evidence to confirm that this was the case, but of course many people in the Western media jumped on it and assumed that this report had to be true. Supposedly 11 North Korean soldiers were killed by the Ukrainians in this first clash. As I said, the Ukrainians up to the time of making of this program, have provided no evidence at all that this is the case. But the media in the West assumes it is. Because the Ukrainians say it, it must be true. I, who have a more skeptical perspective on these things, frankly, don't take these Ukrainian claims, at all seriously. Anyway, Zelensky himself has been grumbling to all sorts of people that the Western response to the presence of these North Korean soldiers has not been what he expected. Ukraine is now fighting not just the Russians, but the entire axis of autocracies. The North Koreans are there. They're fighting. He was expecting that the West would rally to Ukraine's support, and he's now bitterly complaining that this is not the case, that the United States, the Western powers, are taking the presence of the Ukrainians in their stride, that they're not authorizing attacks on the North Korean troops in Kursk region or anything of that kind. And he seems very angry and disappointed about this. He's been sounding increasingly angry and disappointed over the last few months. As first, his victory plan has failed. His various attempts to organize peace conferences have failed. as the Ramstein meeting was called off, as the level of economic and military support has gradually dwindled away, as the $55 billion loan, which became a $50 billion loan, which then became a 40 billion European Union loan, as these loans have so far not materialized. Anyway, he's sounding an increasingly angry and disappointed and even bitter man, just to say. But anyway, he is disappointed that the North Korean story has not so far had the effect of galvanizing the West onto his side, as perhaps he expected. As to the Russians, they're also providing their own information. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry today provided a detailed slideshow of what they said was the proof that the Ukrainians had indeed planned all along to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. And to repeat again what I said what I've just said, because the Russian Ministry of Defense says it, doesn't prove that it was so. And I haven't actually watched this slideshow, so I don't know what information it contains. I believe there are claims that the Ukrainians were intending to deploy up to 27,000 troops and dozens of tanks and other armoured vehicles to try to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. To be precise, this is the TASS summary. The Russian armed forces have provided slides of a report by the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. I suppose this is their claim. Of course, I don't know what the State Emergency Service of Ukraine will say. On the plan to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, a total of 20,000 Ukrainian troops, 27 tanks, 50 armoured vehicles, 30 pieces of artillery, 5 multiple rocket launchers were supposed to be involved in the plan. And the person who has provided us with all of this information, the person who presided over the slideshow, was Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov of the Russian military, and he is the chief of Russia's radiation, chemical, and biological protection troops. Now, to repeat again, because the Russians say it, it doesn't make it true. However, way back in August, when the Kursk operation began, I said that the obvious objective was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. Nothing else explained why the Kursk operation was launched at all. There were no other logical objectives in this region. Certainly the capture of Kursk city was far beyond Ukraine's control, and it made no sense to think that the Ukrainians would commit such large forces to simply capture a couple of 100 square kilometers of small villages and forests and streams in a rather poor, underpopulated region of Western Russia. Now, of course, I said all of that. I wasn't aware, though I did subsequently become so, that there is also, in the area of Kurchatov, near the Kursk nuclear power plant, a facility which houses warheads for tactical nuclear weapons. I did not know of the existence of that facility, but it does seem it does exist. And I accept completely the view of those who say, including a specific source that has been very, very helpful to me, that facility was also almost certainly a target as well. By the way, Lieutenant General Kirillov didn't confine himself the discussion of the Kursk nuclear power plant. He had quite a lot to say about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant as well, at least judging by the TASS reports. He also repeated the claims about Ukraine having plans to develop a dirty bomb. Again, because the Russians say it, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But then Zelensky himself and some of his officials were hinting or talking a few days back, about 10 days ago, that Ukraine might decide to acquire some kind of nuclear weapons capability if the West didn't support Zelensky's victory plan. So, Lieutenant General Kirillov said all of this. Others will have to judge how much of this they want to believe, given that my assessment back in August, from which I have never faltered, that the Kursk nuclear power plant was a Ukrainian objective when they launched the Kursk when the Ukrainians launched the Kursk operation. No one will be surprised if I say that I am strongly inclined to believe what Lieutenant General Kirillov is telling us about this. Anyway, so that's one thing. But elsewhere, the Russians are telling us quite a lot about the general state of the war. And Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk, the government of the Donetsk People's Republic, he speaks about overall a dire situation for the Ukrainian forces right across the contact line. We observe certain difficulties emerging for the enemy proceeding from the level of mobilization, forced mobilization ongoing on Ukrainian territory. Calls to lower the conscription age down to 18 can be heard from Ukrainian TV screens ever more frequently. The frontline situation is deteriorating for Ukrainian troops in Donbass. Pushilin did, however, add the qualifier that the potential of the Ukrainian armed forces should still not be underestimated. So anyway, he talks about a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians. We've had more information about how the Russians have achieved further advances in various places. We will come to that in a moment. But the general mood on the part of the Russians, on the part of Russian commentaries about the state of the war, continues to be broadly positive. And we learn that the Ukrainian General Staff itself, for example, is saying that the situation in the Kurakovo area continues to be tense. There is one broad point that I am going to make in advance of the US election, in advance of the US election and the inauguration of the new president. And that is that I think that the new president and his or her team do need to understand one thing, that in conventional war terms, the Russians have won the war in Ukraine. They have successfully defeated the Ukrainian army. The balance of power, the correlation of forces between Russia and Ukraine is continuing to tip decisively and ever more so in Russia's favor. The Ukrainians are still resisting and they're still fighting, but as we've seen, even the Pentagon doubts that they will be able to continue to do that for very much longer. So the trend of events is going very clearly in Russia's direction. And if we're talking about weapons supplies from the United States, if the type of assistance the United States and the other Western countries are going to stick with is going to be of the same sort that we have seen up to now, supplies of more Striker infantry fighting vehicles, supplies of ATACMS missiles. I discussed yesterday how ATACMS missile strikes seem to have come effectively to an end. There was an attack, or at least the Russians say that they shot down 4 ATACMS missiles a couple of days ago, but that was an isolated attack, and we're hearing less and less about ATACMS strikes any longer. Anyway, if it's all confined to what we have seen since 2022 of the West supplying weapons and advisors and mercenaries and those sort of things, the new president needs to understand that that isn't going to work. The Russian military-industrial system is now operating at full speed. The Russian army is becoming ever more powerful. The NATO Supreme Commander, General Cavalry, has said as much, that the Russian army is bigger and better than it was in 2022. Even that article in the New York Times, while making all kinds of negative comments about the Russians, admitted that the Russian army of today is a different proposition from the army that the Russians had when they first marched into Ukraine in 2022. So, in conventional military terms, the Russians have won the war. Now, the president has a choice. The new president has a choice. Either continue doing what has been done up to now, in which case the Russians aren't going to win and will dictate terms, and the West will face a major geopolitical defeat with all kinds of negative consequences that flow from that. Or alternatively, to seek negotiations with the Russians aimed principally at limiting the damage, or to escalate in an incredibly dangerous way, such as has never been attempted up to now. By that I mean sending Western troops to Ukraine to fight the Russians there, authorizing or conducting missile strikes deep inside Russia, doing those sort of things. And these would be incredibly reckless steps which are filled with enormous dangers. The president has a choice between these 3 options. In any sane world, the third option would be ruled out. It would come down to a choice between the first 2. And as far as I'm concerned, it is a no-brainer. The logical thing to do is to start talking to the Russians. Just saying. But anyway, I just wanted to say this. We could talk, and I'm going to in a moment, about, the various fights that are taking place in different parts of Ukraine, in Kurakovo and west of Selidovo and in Toretsk and Siversk and wherever. But fundamentally, we are now past that point where it's no longer a case of whether the Russians win, but when they win and what they're going to do with that victory. Unless, as I said, diplomacy steps in and tries to find some diplomatic way out. Now, after just those words, let's turn to the actual situation on the battle lines. And there's been lots of news, it mostly focused on the Kurakovo area. And I'm not going to get into the huge level of detail because I don't pretend that I've followed the detail as closely as some do. But I think the general sense is that the Russians are not acting in exactly the way that many people expected that they would. There was a confident expectation a couple of days ago, I've discussed it in many programs, that the Russians, having captured Yasnaya Polyana, north of Ugledar, north of the village of Shakhtarska, was going to press forward and advance towards the village of Constantinople from Yasnaya Polyana, and we're going to do that in order to cut off the Ukrainians in Kurakovo, and that by cutting off the Ukrainians in Kurakovo, they would create a cauldron, which would create a crisis for the Ukrainian troops in that town. Well, the Russians are advancing, and they're advancing quite rapidly, and they're advancing northwards. But from what I've been able to understand from the various reports, they're not advancing in exactly the way and in exactly the direction that many people had anticipated. This is true both south of Kurakovo, in the area north of Ugledar, and north of Kurakovo and the Kurakovo area, in the area south of Selidovo. And there's lots of speculation and rumors as to why this is the case and whether the lines, what the arrows of the Russian advances really mean, and why the Russians aren't doing that which everybody expected that they were going to do. And I think that this is actually a useful corrective to many of the speculations we see that appear on Telegram channels and TV and video sites. Now, we can't fully second guess what the leaderships of the two armies are going to do. We can make shrewd guesses from time to time, but ultimately the decisions are made by the military leaders of the two sides, and by definition, they don't share their plans with us. And we can make some guesses, but ultimately they are guesses. And it's always important to remember that if we're talking about the Russians, they are far better informed, immeasurably better informed, about the state of the battlefield than any outside commentator is. And if the Russians aren't advancing directly from Bogi-Yavlenka and Yasnaya Polyana towards Constantinople, it is not because they are stupid and because they can't read maps. It is because they know facts about the situation, which we don't. They also, doubtless, want to keep everybody guessing. One of the great fallacies, myths of this war, is that because there are so many means of surveillance nowadays, satellites and drones and things of that kind, it is impossible, supposedly, to take the other side by surprise. In fact, surprises have been launched by both sides many times in this war. The Ukrainians carried out a surprise, or may have done, back in August when they launched the Kursk offensive. That's, of course, unless you believe that the Kursk offensive was actually a trap that the Ukrainians were lured into by the Russians, as a source has told me. So that was perhaps a surprise. The Russians have shown great skill in launching tactical surprises. Nobody, for example, expected in May that they would launch a frontal assault on Toretsk, or that assault would be as successful as it has turned out to be. So we should not be surprised that the Russians are not heading directly for Constantinople. And there may be good reasons why this is so. It could be that the defences south of Constantinople are a lot stronger than we know, Or it could be that the Ukrainians are moving more and more troops to this area rather than pulling out, and the Russians, on the principle that it is never a good idea to interfere with the other side whilst it is making a mistake, are allowing the Ukrainians to do that so that more Ukrainian troops fall into the bag when the cauldron is closed, just to say. Or it could be because that was never the Russian plan in the first place. And it may be, and there are reasons to think this, that the Russian plans in this area have centered more on clearing the villages northwest of Bogoyavlenka, places like Ganivka, Vesely High, Romanivka, and of course Antonivka, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, and the others. Now, as to that, we have had reports, well, we know for some time that the Russians have captured one of these villages, which is Katerinovka. But one of the brigades, Ukrainian brigades, which is defending the villages in this area, which is the 79th Brigade, the same brigade which previously defended heroically the village of Novomikhailovka from attack by the Russian army, and then Konstantinovka, and then Katerinovka. Anyway, the 79th Brigade has now issued another of its deeply despondent messages. They're saying that the defenses in all of these villages, Antonivka, Yelizavetivka, and Ilinka, have collapsed, that the Russians are sweeping through these villages, and they are soon going to be in complete control of them. Now, we shouldn't discount what the 79th Brigade says. A couple of weeks ago, they reported that Katerinovka had been abandoned by the Ukrainian troops, that resistance there had failed, and though it took a while before confirmation was received that the Russians had indeed successfully occupied the whole of Katerinovka, eventually that confirmation was provided, and it did turn out that even though it might have taken a little longer than the 79th Brigade wanted us to think, Katerinovka had indeed fallen to the Russians. So if the 79th Brigade is now saying that Ukrainian defenses in these other villages, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, and Antonivka, has collapsed, then we should take that very seriously. After all, they're there on the ground. They know a lot more about the situation than we do. And if that is true, then one can start to see why the major axis of the Russian advance is not towards Constantinople. Because, of course, with the fall of all of these villages, the Russians are coming much closer to advancing on Kurakovo from the south. And it may be that we're not looking so much at the creation of an immediate cauldron around Kurakovo, but the prospects of a Russian advance on Kurakovo from the south have accelerated and have intensified. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation in the south. Something fairly similar is taking place north of the Kurakovo reservoir. So about a week ago, the Russians captured the important town of Selidovo, over 20,000 people. Then, a couple of days ago, I don't think I mentioned this in a program, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the Russians had captured the village of Vishnevo, which is located just to the west of Selidovo. And we've had reports that the Russians have been conducting attacks on a number of other villages, north or west of Selidovo and Vishnevo, villages like Grigorovka and Petrivka, and also the villages of Novo Alexievka, which is located to the southwest of Selidovo, and the villages of Novodimitrivka, which is located further south of Selidovo and west of Tsukurinye, and also the village of Zoria. So it looks as if the Russians are focused at the moment in clearing an arc of villages to the west of Selidovo. And the most difficult of these villages to capture will apparently be the village of Sontsivka, which is apparently heavily fortified by the Ukrainians. But of course, if the other villages all fall, then Sontsivka could be isolated and the Russians could push west and cut the main road from Pokrovsk going south towards Kurakovo as well, the road to the west of the Kurakovo reservoir. And that would also create another opening for the Russians to push southwards towards Andreevka and the other villages, Rozliv, which the Russians, and Constantinople, which the Russians are close to attacking from the south. So, putting aside the question of what exactly the Russian plans are, one can see that the Russian advance, despite the fact that we're now in the rainy season, continues. The Russians continue to push north and west from Ugledar and ultimately from Marinka. They're pushing steadily towards Kurakovo from both of those directions. And they are also pushing west and southwest from Selidovo, gradually clearing all the territory south of Pokrovsk, which will be ultimately, I'm no doubt, their ultimate objective, which I'm sure they will begin an attack upon before the end of this year. So anyway, the Russian offensive goes on. And of course, there's been Russian offensives, continuing Russian offensives in other places too. In Toretsk, as I've discussed in recent programs, the Russians are back in the Zabalka district. They are gradually regaining territory there. And it could be that once the Zabalka district does fall completely and securely under Russian control, that we will be back in the situation in Toretsk that I believed we were in 3 weeks ago, when it looked as if Toretsk was about to fall. And in fact, the loss of the Zabalska district, once and for all and conclusively this time, logically would leave the Ukrainians with little option but to pull back from Toretsk. And there's more reports from Chasiv Yar. Russians, as I say, seem to be closing on Chasiv Yar, both from the south and from the north. There is a potential encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar. There's heavy fighting going on around Siversk. I get the expression that the fighting in Siversk, the Ukrainians have perhaps similar numbers of troops to the Russians, and that the Russians so far have not been giving Siversk the same level of priority as they have the other battle areas. I also get the impression that the numbers of troops on each side is not huge. We're probably talking about fewer than 10,000 men on each side, probably significantly less than that. But anyway, there's been reports of more fighting in Siversk, of more Russian advances in the area south of Siversk. There are reports that say that the Russians have captured a village south of Siversk, which is the village of Ivano-Darivka. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that this village had been captured by the Russians weeks ago. Ukrainian reports, which many assume to be true, claimed that the village had been recaptured by the Ukrainians. We now have evidence that the Russians are in control of that village. Perhaps that Ukrainian counterattack was not that successful after all. Perhaps the Russians successfully repelled it. Who knows? But anyway, there continues to be heavy fighting around this particular village, and the Russians are taking their time with Siversk. As I said, I don't think that they are giving it as much priority as they are giving priority to other places. Somewhat to the west of Siversk, on the east bank of the Zherebets River, the Russians, however, are now busy fighting to capture the important village of Torske. There are reports that the Russians are also pushing south towards another important village, which is Yampol. And there are also, this is actually north of Torske, that they're also pushing to capture the village of Yampolivka, which is north of Torske, and that they have captured around half of the village of Terny, which is also located to the north of Torske. These Russian attacks on the Zherebets River, on all of these villages, given that the Russians are advancing and are so close to Siversk, if these villages on the Zherebets River fall, then it seems to me that the fate of Siversk is sealed. And I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians will want to leave an isolated garrison effectively surrounded in Siversk, and they will probably pull out. And that is probably why the Russians are giving less attention to Siversk than they might otherwise do. Just to say, there's also the very heavy fighting around the Oskol River near Kupiansk. Luke Harding in The Guardian gave us a vivid account of that battle and how the Russians are now very close to attacking Kupiansk itself and are 2 miles apparently from Kupiansk. And further north, there continue to be lots of rumours and claims about what's going on in the Kursk area. Putting aside the Ukrainian claims that they fought the North Koreans, for which they've, as I said, provided no actual confirmation. There are reports that the Russians are preparing another major attack over the next few days in the Kursk area. The autumn rains make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to move their troops through the woods and fields. And of course, the roads in the Kursk area are dominated now by Russian drones. The Russians, by the way, conducted a successful Iskander strike on a Ukrainian base in Kursk region, destroying several Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and killing up to 60 Ukrainian soldiers and destroying other Ukrainian vehicles as well. We have the pictures of the strike. But anyway, one way or the other, it looks as if the Russians are preparing another attack, the purpose of which, again, presumably is to slice off more of this salient, surround and force the surrender of more Ukrainian soldiers. Putin a week ago said that up to 2,000 Ukrainian troops had been trapped in a pocket in this Kursk area. We haven't heard much about that, but it does look as if that pocket has been extinguished. Anyway, that the Russians are preparing to slice off more of the Kursk pocket or salient. I get the sense that for the moment, the Russians are content, however, to allow the salient itself to survive, because for political reasons, Zelensky and Syrskyi continue to pour troops, Ukrainian troops, into the salient to try to hold the Russians back and to hold on to this useless ground because of the political costs to the Ukrainians of not doing so. And since the Russians still practice attrition, on the Ukrainians. They're content to allow the Ukrainians to do it, making the process of attrition from a Russian point of view still easier. Anyway, that's the overall situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine today. Let me repeat again. The new president, if he or she is realistic, will recognize that the war in Ukraine is already lost. Whether the new president has that ability to see that, whether the new president has the capacity to draw those conclusions, or whether the new president will instead try to do more of the same, continue to hide behind the mantras that the US will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and that kind of thing, or whether the new president will engage in some incredibly reckless and dangerous escalation. Well, that remains to be seen. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. By the time I do my program tomorrow, we should have a lot more clarity about the election outcome in the United States. We shall all have to wait and see. But in the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for today. Tomorrow, we may be at the beginning of a new era, or perhaps not. One way or the other, we shall eventually know. Thank you for joining me once again, and have a very good day.